Thank you, Mr. Singhi, and further easing the vehicle analogy by saying that instead of or in place of combining the 6 destination goals into one happiness goal is certainly a interesting way to look at it. Before I turn to the delegates for some questions, since the partnerships has come through across all the panelists' comments as well as a specific goal also, may I actually turn to Yuri and request him to share a few thoughts on also in his capacity as the UNDP has got a fair amount of convening power around the world for many developmental programs. So what makes partnerships work? Because quite often in many areas partnership is there as a thought, but quite often it doesn't work and translate into something real. So what makes it work where it has worked, and what are the kind of preconditions, and around that if I would request you to share some thoughts.
You don't ask easy questions, don't you? Look, the best way maybe is to illustrate by a concrete example, because some of you in the room may relate. Partnerships, especially 21st century partnerships, is a complex undertaking. But I think the short answer to your question is it has to be a win-win-win situation. I mean, that's always the key to any partnership. Every side needs to be satisfied that they're getting the minimum of what they need and want out of the business deal, right? But let me give you a concrete example. I mentioned from the podium the housing issue. And in India, it's a complex issue. Some say 60 million homes, right, need to be built. Now, how do you offer to industry a value proposition where you tell them, we need to build this number of homes. We know you're going to be taking a risk. How can we reduce this risk to you? And that's how government comes in with creating an environment where this deal starts looking interesting for industry, and they are starting to be interested in investing in something like this. Then you go to the communities and you say, look, we know we need to build prefabricated housing. We know you people don't like prefabricated housing. What would make you consider to buy or own or move into a prefabricated home? And then people from the villages and from the ground and from the city say, well, you know, I'd like it to be culturally like this, and I'd like it to be designed like that, and I want a little terrace, and I want a place to tie my cow in the garden, and you know, I want a little shop space in the back, and whatever it is. But then, similar to your experience here in India with the light bulb, when you said, look, the light bulb is feasible if it costs whatever it was, 29 cents to the rupee, and then it becomes feasible. So how does government take away the initial risk? Maybe by offering an initial public investment or a subsidy scheme or an incentive scheme, or eliminating, maybe giving a tax break for a couple of years to make it interesting for business to invest. How it then ensures that that investment is long-term? Well, by saying, look, we're going to need 60 million homes, and if you guys build an industry, we'll give you 30 million orders. Then you go to the community and you say, look, this is the deal. We need 21st century homes. We need them fireproof, disaster proof. We need them with energy built in. We need them comfortable. We need them with a warranty that they will last for at least 30 years, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then when all these groups come together, they say, all right, how do we actually make it happen? Which is actually a practical question that I'm asking to you people in the audience right now, because that's a question bothering me today. We have the models. We have the solutions. We know that it can be done. We know that it can be done for 1.4 lakhs. We just don't know how to structure a deal for it that is actually viable for you, acceptable by the government, yeah, and interesting for the communities. But we've done the homework, we've done the research. So those of you in the room from the housing industry, please come forward, let's sit down. We need to figure out how to make 1 million houses per year in a factory, with 5 factories around the country producing 5 million homes that can be delivered to the location and installed, and the person in the village is going to be happy with what we together delivered for them, and that home is going to last for the next 30 years. It's how to structure that business deal in a win-win-win situation that defines a partnership. I hope maybe that concrete example illustrates what type of things we're looking for. But the same goes for, solar technologies or renewable energies or, car manufacturers finding a viable solution where a government like in Europe creates a viable regulatory regime that forces industry or encourages industry to go to Euro 5 standard on emissions or to reduce, average emissions from vehicles across the fleet and in general bring these things down. So it's a cooperation framework where it's a give and take.
Thanks, Yuri. I think it's a good framework to look at in terms of both at a broader sectoral level, at an individual level as to what the opportunities are, what the risks are, and what the costs are, and then stitch a win-win-win out of that as the formula that we'll take away from that input. So now may I turn to the delegates for pooling a few questions. We'll take 4 or 5 questions, and then after that we get back to the panel to respond to them and then close out with that so that we make the time efficient use. So just about 4 or 5 questions and brief, and start.
My name is Virendra Raturi. I come from Social Responsibility Asia. My query is to Mr. Yuri. I would like to understand from you that how these SDGs would be, managed in terms of the performance management systems. Because we know that, the way the government works, for example, in India for the last 65 years, what we have achieved is all in front of us. Looking at that, in that context, maybe India or different countries, are there any suggestive, performance management framework also being talked about or suggested, that how eventually with what kind of processes or systems these things would be achieved? Because that I find would be a very, very difficult challenge when we talk about engaging with various partners. So that's the query I have. Thank you.
Thank you for giving me the mic, and thank you for a session discussing SDGs. I think the learning curve is high, so I can see there's still a long way to go, even trying to understand what is it that's really required. I have 2 questions really, and any one of you can respond to them. One, where is gender equality? Goal 5 is gender equality, that's one. I don't see it on the dais, and I don't mean only women who are affected. I think the poorest women still have the ingenuity and the competence and the knowledge to look for solutions and actually adopt solutions with the back to the wall. So I think we're looking for women who can really make a change. Which links to the second bit of query is that where are the people, So I'm Aditi Kapoor, I work with Alternative Futures. We're a research organization on sustainability. So the thing is that it's fine to, have technological solutions and give income to remove poverty, etc., but nothing gets absorbed in society, and we've seen that. We work a lot on climate change. There are technologies, there are policies. Why is it that it doesn't get absorbed? So where are the people? I think the social dimensions to the SDGs is something that has to be taken into account if we're really trying to make a change in the system. And for that, the inclusion of people in all the discussions. It's not a top-down thing where things are going to be done to remove poverty. It's the people who have to remove poverty themselves. Where are they in the discussion fora? Where are they as part of solutions? Where are they who feel, well, this is right, this is not right, I don't think this is the way the discussions should go. So I think, who are we talking about? What are the plans to kind of involve them on formal platforms? How do we make this discussion a whole? That's really my question. Thank you.
Yeah, my question is to the George and whoever want to answer this. India has not achieved number of targets set in a MDG. So, has India spent a required amount of money which used to achieve the target? Now the George is saying that we need a 1 trillion to at least achieve the SDG. So just tell me about that, how much India had spent on MDG. And another question is this about the, even I have a query about the SDG, sustainability. Was the MDG was not sustainable? It's a conceptual level question. My query, my curiosity is this. Was the MDG was not sustainable in its nature? Or is the SDGs really a sustainable? Is it sustainable in itself? So I have some this kind of queries. Please respond.
Hi, sir. Myself, Manas Daulani. I'm a member of the Policy and Strategy Group of the UN World We Want campaign. It's typically an open question to anybody, and it's a two-pronged question. The MDGs were certainly made for a 10-year period, and then we gave a 5-year extension. And still the reports say that we were not able to, successfully implement either of them out of all those which are there. And now, as Yuri at the starting himself said, that he wouldn't want to get into the text because it really doesn't have much of importance to a lot of people over here. So the first question being that where the SDGs directly do not, refer to the target market or really, involve the target market, how do we plan to implement them? I mean, it's an elaborate question, but typically that's where we failed at MDGs. And my second question being, SDGs had only one paragraph. I mean, I was there at the IGN when it was going and shut down at 5 in the morning. We had coffee and cookies. That was interesting. But we had one paragraph on the, we all like to use a fancy word, youth. And there was only one paragraph, and that too was removed towards the end. How do we again plan to involve where the UN time and again has been emphasizing on 1.8 billion stronger population of young people around the globe, and that being a core place where they would want to work at?
Yeah, I'm Naghari from ITC. Everywhere we are thinking of big. We have got into a mindset of creating bigger organizations, bigger cities, bigger plants, looking at economy. But a few decades back, an economist, Shoemaker, coined a phrase, small is beautiful. Read a good book. Can this forum consider small is sustainable? Can we look in that direction?
Hi, this is Shruti from Humana People to People India, and I've been following a very interesting range of topics that were raised while we were talking about SDGs. But interestingly, again, in the scenario when conflict across the world is so high, I am interested to know, the whole idea of sustainable cannot be talked about without looking at the kind of conflicts we are having internationally, as well as the kind of conflicts we are having nationally at the local levels. We are talking about all these things from a very top, hanging, superficial kind of a level. We are not looking at the way things are. And the way things are, these conflicts have to be brought in, weaved into our thought process when we are talking about where we want to go, what goals do we want to achieve. And I find these conflicts and the relationship between governance, development, corporates, very strangely missing. So have we thought of the scenario of conflict at all these levels when we were discussing, thinking about SDGs? Thank you.
Thank you. I think while there will be more questions, I think in the interest of time, we will stop there and turn to panelists. With most questions, I would shift to Yuri and George. But any of the other questions that the other three panelists would like to take on or make any other final comment. So we will start with Alan and then move to Mr. Singhi and then Andreas and then George and finally Yuri to wrap up with interviewing the question that came up as well as any final comments.
Thank you. I will cover mainly two questions that were really raised to me. Quite important actually also. The gender aspect, gender equity. Obviously we haven't spoken about that in details, but if you look at the SDGs, there are specific targets and indicators and also a specific sustainable development goal that are related directly or strictly to the gender issue. So this is absolutely a must in order to achieve sustainability. In that sense, again, coming back on the urban issues, one of the specific target is related, as I mentioned, to the safer cities. Obviously, on this aspect of safer city, it's women and children and kids that are mostly appeal for this target, let's say. So in order that the women and kids feel safer in the city, it's a must for authorities and for private sector, for civil society to get involved in order to design and to build a safer public space mainly. I would like also on this gender issue to mention a very, very interesting, positive initiative from Government of India related to this gender issue. It's talking about the Housing for All program managed by the HUPA, by the Ministry of Urban Housing. I'm not sure if the Housing for All program managed by Rural Development has the same criteria, but within HUPA, the Housing for All program, the new one that has been launched 3 months ago in June, I think, all new titles will be given to women, not to men. For me, it's a big, big achievement that we cannot see in so many countries. I cannot quote 2 or 3 more countries worldwide where women are giving official titles for owning houses. So this is for me a very, very good aspect for India. Talking about the last intervention, small is beautiful. Yes and no. In terms, again, I'm thinking in terms of urban issues, urbanization. Small is beautiful. If everybody wants his own small house, his own plot, it's not beautiful because it's not sustainable. Small is beautiful if we think in terms of cities getting more compact, more densified. In that case, small is beautiful because in terms of sustainability, in terms of cost, more compact, more densified is the city. Lower are the costs for providing building infrastructure, for providing basic services such as water and sanitations, and lower are the costs also for mobility. So small is beautiful, yes, but at some extent we should not neither appeal for everybody has a small housing unit, because that way we have cities that are expanding too much and this is not sustainable.
You know, we are now talking that whether MDGs were right or SDGs would be right. But I think overall, if you look at goals, they are good for the human being, good for the globe, and that's why without creating much conflict in the interpretations, I think all should concentrate on that how we can make life of people more healthy and more prosperous. Similarly, one of the way of giving housing is how to create affordable housing, and for that purpose, I think the policy of the government that to have housing for all and how to create it faster. And in that case, many cement companies, and particularly our organization is working on that how in few months' time, houses for the poor people, houses in small villages or small towns can be created with latest technology, and how precasting work can be done, and how they can be made more greener by using, you know, the cement which uses or which has the least carbon footprints. Similarly, on technology adoption, I think many sectors in India are adopting latest technology which are available worldwide, but there are certain issues, more particularly because of financing, non-availability of right finance at right time may also might be leading to certain constraints in using the best technology. And the world over, the way now it is being discussed, that how developed world can fund the emerging economies, developing economies by whether clean development fund, green development fund, or whatever may be. That may help emerging economies to work on it, and more particularly now it is being talked about that during the period 2016 to 2020, how financing can be done even for sustainable development goals. So I'm sure now with this effort of CII and with the efforts of all of you, we would be in a better world. Thank you.
So let me reflect a bit on the small is beautiful question that was the last one actually as well. And you know, industries in classical terms are relating to growth, right? You know, whenever we are not growing, we consider ourselves shrinking actually, even though it's probably maintaining only the status quo. Even that is not so much in the business agenda. So what is decisive though is to combine growth and sustainability, which is possible, right? And the key to that is innovation and innovation and innovation. It's really about technology, and technology in this case not being part of the problem generating issues, but really being part of the solution. So I think you don't need to think about limiting growth so much, but you need to grow intelligently, smartly, and sustainable. Just to give you one example, which is not so much about less is more in the terms of dimensions, but less is more in terms of weight, for example. The BMW i3, the battery electric vehicle I was referring to, is made of carbon fiber to a large degree, which brings down the weight of the car distinctively, right? So it's 300 to 400 kilograms lighter than a comparable steel car would be. That means it is much more efficient, and it produces by far less energy consumption, in this case electric energy. So we have innovated here, we have made a car better using technology, materials and so on and so on. So it is ultimately more sustainable than its traditional predecessors, and we still can grow with this car in a new niche of electric vehicles with an ultimate goal of making mobility carbon neutral, carbon free ultimately. So that's one thing on the small is beautiful front, so to say. The other one is the topic of conflicts. You mentioned, and I'm not so sure whether I got your question right, but let me still put a focus on what is going on currently in Europe, and that is the refugee crisis, right? And that in particular in Germany, and I'm living in Munich, where a large portion of the refugees from Syria are actually coming into the Munich train station. So we have that topic right in front of our own doorsteps in a literal meaning of the words, right? And you know, the general thinking in Germany, and certainly with me, is that this is a huge chance for German society and for European societies in the whole, right? We are getting talented people who really want to frame their life and really want to be productive and be part of a society that is democratic and so on and so on. But I think for the sustainability framing and for the SDGs, I think it's super decisive to also think that, and also think that in a European perspective. You know, some of the European countries will always say, you know, SDGs, that is also very much a developing country phenomena to some degree. There are many things that others need to do, not us so much. We have all under control and so on and so on. This is no longer the case, right? This world is global also in the perspective of conflicts. These conflicts are coming to Europe ultimately. You know, that has been, you know, the whole idea of the fortress Europe and so on, all this stuff has been thought 20 years ago, but now we have the situation and we need to make best use of it, and the SDGs will show their ability to function also in that respect. They have to, right?
Yeah, it's better for me to go before the res rep of UN, because then I can do the constructive criticism of the UN system and then he can do the moderation. Couple of questions I'm going to answer together by taking it in the chronological order. Somewhere around mid-1999, before the dawn of the new millennium, there were a bunch of UN bureaucrats in New York that got into the basement of the UN building and said, listen, the new millennium is dawning, the UN needs to announce something. So let's look for something. And I'm telling you, this is a true story. Yuri, you'll bear me out for this. Because we need the global leaders to meet during the global millennium, dawn of the new millennium, and announce something. And true to the UN system, and Aditi, this comes to your question, where are the people? A bunch of the most brilliant UN bureaucrats sat in the basement and put together the Millennium Development Goals, which came out through a summit, and global leaders announced it in the dawn of the new millennium. So the starting point of the MDGs, frankly, was the basement of the UN building in New York. So did it have science? Did it have what? Ask God. That's the best way to put it. Fortunately, it focused on important issues. The 8 goals, the 19-odd targets, the 40-odd indicators focused on. They were pragmatic about it. They knew they couldn't touch the hard stuff. So they said, can we halve poverty? Can we halve malnutrition? Can we do all the halving business? And said, can we do it in 10 years? So it was an easy announcement to make for the global leaders, which was nice, number one. It did not really involve the global north or the industrialized world, for the simple reason all these things are in poor countries. So in fact, it was a conditionality on aid. If you wanted aid from the industrialized world, thou shalt do this. Whereas, as was rightly pointed out, the SDGs is different. It involves, it's the survival of the human species. So it's human well-being plus planetary well-being, the breadth that was talked about. It also involves, in terms of the breadth, the two communities. It involves the industrialized world, it involves the developing world. So there's no running away, it's a coming together. Now, let me answer the question, have the people been involved? If I have to put my hand on my heart, in the last 3 years, frankly, no. There's been very, very little. The UNDP was chartered with the responsibility of putting this together across the world in terms of participation. To a certain extent, things happened, but to the extent it needs to be required in a participatory manner, no, it did not happen. It's going to take place in the next phase. So, how much have the people been involved? Very, very little. Mostly it has been, even in the government of India, it's been pockets of the government of India, some state governments involved here and there, some think tank NGO types also involved, and that's been in the 190 odd countries. I would go to the extent of saying at least 150 countries, this is exactly what happened. There are about 20-30 countries where more depth of consultation has taken place. So is it that participatory? Fortunately, I'm telling you, scientifically, even though you see the mass and the way I explained it, something interesting is coming out. How much money was spent on the MDGs, I do not know, but you will be talking about the report that came out. The monitoring system, performance monitoring system, let me relate these two questions. The MDG had something called the CSD, Commission for Sustainable Development. Frankly, and I can criticize, he cannot say it. It was the worst monitoring system on the face of this earth. It was a rubbish being presented by all the countries to the UN system in such a way that everybody could bluff. I hope the next one that is being put together, an interesting system is being put together. I hope the next one is good. However, what was interesting is, and this is where it applies to all of us, and let's not look to government to do this. The variety of initiatives that were taken by corporations and civil society institutions, when some of these learnings were put together, it was found that the diversity of these initiatives actually contributed to the Millennium Development Goals, and it is expected in terms of crowdsourcing, you will be mentioning what UN Stats is doing. In terms of crowdsourcing these kind of initiatives, a different monitoring system is being envisaged. Finally, to that last question, I belong to one of the 7 institutions across the world that was started as part of Schumacher Small is Beautiful. Hard experience from across the world. Small is beautiful if it can be aggregated for scale. You cannot have economies because, and I'll tell you what it is, let's look at the Indian context. Anything in the development process which you talk about anywhere in the world, it has taken place in India. It's an oasis or a graveyard. The country is still a desert. If you cannot aggregate for scale, you will never get the economies of scale, you will never be able to compete. So yes, small is beautiful because diversity is an essential element for sustainability, but it needs to be aggregated. Thank you.
All right. Right, I thought I had business people in the audience, but most of you must be UN staff sitting there and just don't know about it. Okay, look, I think some of the questions have been very well answered just a moment ago. Just as a kind of urban legend, he's absolutely right how the MDGs were born. However, the key word in what he just said is they were a bunch of brilliant minds that conceptualized a concept and pushed it out there. And frankly, a lot of people criticize MDGs for what they are, and there's legitimate criticism. But frankly, looking back for over 15 years, it is the only and the best advocacy planetary tool that we have invented so far. Okay? So I'm being careful with what I say, but as an advocacy tool in focusing governments to look at poverty, mortality, health issues, HIV, AIDS, it was a uniquely positioned tool, and from that perspective, I'm sorry, it is a success. As a development agenda that is monitored, calculated, tracked, evaluated, no. It is not a brilliant example of crispness and order, but it is what it is. Now, will the SDG have less hard targets, right, on the SDGs, and ultimately it's up to the countries of what they believe is achievable within their economic means, within the place in history and in development where they are. So they will have to kind of put forward, just like they did in the MDGs, but in a slightly more sophisticated way, what they want to achieve, how, and how much money they want to put into it or aim to put into it. Look, at the end of the day, any global deal is an aspirational proclamation. But the reason it is important because it focuses the collective mind. The lady who was asking about conflict is absolutely right. And the answer, I think, that you gave about Munich was very, very appropriate. It will influence us, but without focusing the global mind and the global will at a time of global geostrategic shifts, where we are experiencing tension, and we will be experiencing tension, but without focusing that global mind on a set of issues, we cannot move forward. So it is a tug of war. I'm sorry that it is, and I'm not happy to report this to you, but I think you understand it even better than I do that that's the case. Yeah, we are wrapping up. Last but not least, there was a sustainability question in there on the MDGs and the SDGs. Look, the reason they were cooked in the basement, actually the Millennium Declaration was a legitimate process. The MDGs came as an implementation mechanism to the Millennium Declaration. But sustainability was not part of it. Climate was not a big feature there because the writers of the MDGs knew that you cannot achieve a deal on climate quickly and now. That's why it's taken 15 years. So they, by definition, kind of obfuscated the climate and sustainability issue. But since this was done in the last 15 years, it became such a burning issue that everybody is now talking about it. So the political context for achieving sustainability dimension of the development agenda is now there, and hopefully we'll see it come through in Paris in whichever way it comes through, but there will be some sort of a deal. That's the best way I can answer it, but that's the difference between one and the other, and why one we call the sustainable and the other one we call the millennium. But it's a technicality that I think you should not kind of lose the substance in the shuffle of words. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So as I just pass on to Martin, let me thank all the panelists and all the delegates in active participation, and we are already run well out of our time. So back to Martin.